Northern Italy, April 1944. The air trembled with heat. Inside my P-51 Mustang, the metal vibrated like a heartbeat. Every dial quivered. Every rivet hummed. Sweat ran down my back beneath the flight suit, tracing a line straight to the small of my spine. Below, hell itself. Smoke. Fire. Columns of German armor grinding through the valley, treads flashing in sunlight like teeth. Command's voice came through the headset, flat, cold, absolute. Abort mission. Return to base. That's an order. I kept looking down. Through the canopy, I saw our boys, American infantry scattered among the olive groves, pinned between tanks and artillery. Tiny figures against the earth. Moving slower each minute. If I turned away now, they'd be gone before sunset. I whispered one word to no one but myself. No. Then I pushed the nose forward. The Mustang's frame shuddered as I dove. The sky tore apart, blue turning to blur, tracer fire rising like claws from the valley floor. The engine howled. My heart followed. That was the moment I broke formation. The moment everything that followed began. Spring, 1944. The Italian front near Medina looked orderly on a map, rivers as blue threads, roads as clean veins, ridgelines shaded with a staff officer's pencil. From the cockpit, it was different. The Apennines broke the air into crosswinds and downdrafts, smoke rose in slow columns from shelled farmhouses, convoys clung to curves like insects on glass. We flew above it all, a neat formation under a neat doctrine. The 12th Air Force owned the daylight, so the wires said. Our radios carried the rule like scripture: no solo attacks, no low-altitude dives, no deviation from orders. We were to find, fix, and report. Precision strikes came when the board allowed them, with proper escort, proper altitude, proper signatures. The system prized symmetry, flights of 4, altitudes in thousands, timings in minutes. War, reduced to arithmetic. On paper it meant control. In the valley it meant silence. A platoon could vanish between signal checks, and the log would still read, reconnaissance negative, light resistance. I learned how tidy words could be. Harassing fire. Sporadic flak. Armor elements displaced. Down there, displacement was men leaving pieces of themselves on packed dirt. I was 20. Lieutenant. A pilot who could keep the Merlin at 2,600 revolutions per minute without blowing the coolant past the red arc, who could hold a line in turbulence without chasing the needle. I understood machines, I respected procedures. But procedures have a heartbeat only when they meet weather, terrain, and the enemy's will. Headquarters spoke in geometry. The valley spoke in heat. We were told the Germans were pulling back in good order. I watched them anchor. Panzer IVs dug into terraces with their hulls masked, 75mm G*NS laid to intersect every switchback. Half-tracks nosed into stone barns, canvas off, radios up. Nebelwerfer crews parked in orchards where trees hid their smoke. The enemy understood the same lessons our memos ignored: angles, timing, fear. Our own house was orderly. Briefings at dawn, chalkboards, grease pencil circles over Medina, Carpi, Nonantala. Armed recce, grid Kilo 7 to Lima 3, altitude 18,000, fuel to Bingo +10. The colonel's voice never wavered. Observe only. Do not commit. He believed in the lattice, fighters above, artillery behind, infantry ahead, each waiting its turn. Turns slip in mountains. Radios fade. Clouds breed in valleys the way rumors do in barracks. If a call for help climbed past the ridgeline, it arrived as static and a fragment of a name. Below, the fight was improvised. Above, we held formation, fingers on safeties, listening to the metronome of doctrine. I had already learned the translation table. Negative support meant they're alone. Hold position meant we have lost them on the map. Abort meant the paperwork is satisfied. The first time I watched a column of our trucks stalled under mortar fire while our flight orbited at 10,000, I felt the rules settle into my bones like cold. We were the air. We could lift weight. But only if the ledger agreed. Some men accepted it. We observe, kid, one captain told me after a clean, bloodless sortie. We don't set the table. He tapped his flight jacket where the checklist lived. This saves more lives than you will ever see. He wasn't wrong. Discipline keeps wings on airplanes. Discipline brings most of you home. But every system contains a seam. Ours ran along the exact line where ink meets earth. Staff officers drew arrows from west to east. The panzer crews pushed south to north. In that intersection, the valley, the orchard, the culvert where a runner bled out with the handset in his fist, order ended. The war asked a different question than the briefings did. It asked whether a single engine, 650 calibers, and 2 bombs could move a day's outcome by inches. Whether conscience could be flown like a pattern, held steady through flak. Whether one pilot had the right to decide when the ledger was wrong. By April, I knew my answer. I didn't dislike orders. I distrusted distance. I was born in Iowa, where the horizon never ends and sound carries farther than reason. My father ran a small repair shop behind the house, tractors, combines, anything with an engine that coughed before it roared. He said every machine had a temperament, like a horse, and it would tell you what it wanted if you listened right. My first memory is of him leaning over a John Deere Model A cigarette clenched in his teeth, saying, "Hear that rattle? That's not anger. That's hunger." By 12 I could pull a cylinder head blindfolded. By 16 I could tune a carburetor just by smell. I learned the rhythm of tools, the click of a socket wrench, the sigh of compressed air, the pause before ignition. Our world turned on torque and patience. When a bolt stripped, you didn't curse, you found the thread beneath the damage and started again. That's how my father worked, how the land worked, how I was built. My mother was the quieter current. A schoolteacher with hands always dusted in chalk, she believed in reason the way my father believed in noise. She'd grade papers on the porch while he ran engines hot, both of them stubborn in different dialects. She wrote in every letter after I enlisted, "Don't try to be a hero, just come home." I didn't understand the weight of that sentence until much later. In town I was the boy who fixed things that weren't mine. Bicycles, radios, sometimes the neighbor's washing machine. There wasn't glory in it, just the small satisfaction of balance restored. I liked that kind of quiet. The good kind, before the war invented its own version. When I left for flight school in 1942, Iowa disappeared beneath a layer of cloud and guilt. The Army Air Forces promised adventure and geometry. The recruiters called it precision warfare, and to a boy who saw the world through measurements, it sounded like purpose. I believed them. I thought war would be another kind of engineering problem: find the fault, correct it, watch the pattern hold. At Randolph Field the air smelled of oil and chalk dust. We trained under men who'd flown in the last war, the ones who called the Wright brothers amateurs with luck. They taught us more than flying. They taught hierarchy, checklists, radio discipline, blind obedience to procedure. The first rule hammered into our heads was simple: you are the system's hands, not its mind. I obeyed. I always had. Yet every time I gripped the control stick of a BT-13 trainer and felt the vibration through my gloves, a small rebellion stirred, the sense that the plane and I were speaking in a language no manual could translate. Machines were honest. Orders were not. They told us that in combat, altitude was life and emotion was death. You didn't dive below 1,000 unless cleared. You didn't break formation. You didn't improvise. Those who did either burned or vanished from rosters. I memorized every procedure, but I also memorized the sound of an engine just before it failed, that low moan before seizure. The difference between the two kinds of knowledge is what the war would later test. Before Italy, before the mountains and the smoke, I was a mechanic who dreamed of flying straight lines in straight skies. I didn't crave medals or headlines. I wanted to know if a man could understand a machine so completely that together they might bend the rules without breaking apart. When my orders came through, 12th Air Force, Mediterranean Theater, my father shook my hand once, firmly. My mother pressed a Bible into my pack and whispered the same words again: "Don't try to be a hero." I nodded, but I already knew I would fail her. Not out of pride, but out of arithmetic. Because there comes a point when the numbers stop adding up, when the cost of obedience exceeds the sum of all safety. In the last week before shipping out, I stood beside my father's tractor at dusk, listening to the idle. The pistons ticked like a clock. He asked if I was scared. I said no. It was true, but only because I didn't yet know what fear sounded like at altitude, when the air itself becomes thinner than faith. That night I lay awake and thought about control, the illusion that a man turning a wrench or holding a stick could master chaos by touch alone. I believed it then. Maybe I still do. Because before the war made me a pilot, before the heat and smoke and orders that contradicted reason, I was only a listener. A boy in a small Iowa town, hearing the first lesson that would one day save his life. If the machine listens to you, it will save you. If the men above you don't, you listen anyway. They told us Italy was a formality, the enemy retreating north, resistance light. The communiques read like weather forecasts, scattered engagements, minimal opposition. From altitude, you could almost believe it. From the ground, it was a furnace. The contradiction arrived slowly, like corrosion. Our first missions were reconnaissance, circles above valleys where artillery smoke climbed in steady spirals. We photographed grids, noted positions, and returned to base. Report said, no contact. But through the canopy I'd watched entire platoons vanish beneath the trees. You can't mistake that kind of disappearance. One afternoon in March, my flight orbited near Bologna. Below, the road glittered with tank tracks and shattered helmets. A convoy burned at the bend, one of ours. The radio was quiet except for the drone of static. Command ordered, maintain pattern. No engagement. I obeyed. We all did. We passed over twice more, cameras clicking. On the third pass, the fire had spread to the trees. When we landed, the debrief officer wrote, minimal losses. His pen never trembled. The rules were designed by distance. Headquarters saw sectors, not bodies. They believed that if every man did his assigned part, the machine of war would turn without friction. But the truth down there was grit and blood in the gears. The front shifted by hours, not days. Maps aged between briefings. Orders lagged behind reality like shadows at sunset. I began to notice the gap, the interval between what was happening and what was permitted to happen. It lived in the half-second after a distress call, in the hesitation before a trigger pull. It was the space where conscience grew. We rotated missions every third day. Maintenance filled the hours between, refueling, patching bullet holes, recalibrating G** sights fogged by dust. I liked those moments. Machines didn't argue. If you did your part, they answered. Men, on the other hand, repeated the doctrine like a prayer, observe and report. I said it too. But each time, it felt thinner. The veterans had learned to detach. You'll go crazy if you look too long, one said after I mentioned the infantry pinned near Medina. He leaned against his wing, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. We're eyes, not fists. The ones on the ground know that. I nodded, though I knew they didn't. The men on the ground still looked up when our shadows crossed them. They believed the sky meant rescue. Once, over the Pa Valley, we followed a smoke column that wasn't on the map. Through binoculars I saw American half-track stalled on a dirt road, their crews waving panels, yellow for friendly. Around them, German mortar flashes bloomed like sparks. I called it in. The controller's reply came clipped, not authorized. Secondary target only. Return course. For 10 seconds I considered staying. 10 seconds, maybe less, enough to imagine the dive, the trigger, the relief. Then training pulled me back. I throttled up, climbed into the clouds, and left them to their fate. That night the mess tent was loud with card games and music from a field radio. I sat outside by the wingtip light, writing numbers into my logbook, fuel used, altitude, time over target. Routine calmed me. Still, behind the numbers I saw faces I hadn't met. When I turned in the report, the intelligence officer skimmed it and said, "Good discipline, Lieutenant. Not every pilot knows when to hold back." I thanked him. It was the right answer. But discipline has a taste. It's metallic, like the air inside the oxygen mask when you climb above 20,000 feet. You breathe it because you must, not because it sustains you. In those weeks I began to understand the system's true shape. It wasn't a chain of command, it was a chain of deferrals. Everyone waited for someone else to act first. The risk was always too high, the information too thin, the authorization too slow. So the silence thickened until it felt like part of the weather. I didn't break the rules that month. I followed every one. I taxied, took off, maintained formation, logged altitude, and returned. But something in my chest kept ticking out of rhythm. I started asking quiet questions, to no one in particular, just to the hum of the engine at idle. What happens when the book and the sky disagree? Who decides which is true? No one answered, of course. Engines don't judge. They only reveal. The older pilots said disobedience was suicide. Maybe they were right. Still, I began to sense that one day the choice would come, a moment when the numbers, the charts, the rules, all of it, would add up to nothing. And when that moment came, I already knew the sound I'd hear first. The pitch of a Merlin engine lowering into a dive. April 3, 1944. The day began with haze. The valley west of Medina looked harmless from 18,000 feet, gray mist over green fields, a thin ribbon of road crawling toward the mountains. The morning briefing had been clear, routine reconnaissance, light enemy presence, fuel to bingo +15. We were 6 Mustangs in formation, silver knives against a dull sky. At 0940 hours, the first voice broke through the static. It wasn't command. It was panic. This is Baker 2, they're all around us. Requesting air. Then nothing. Just the rattle of interference and a single scream swallowed by static. The call shouldn't have reached us, we were outside the artillery net. But I recognized the frequency. Infantry, 36th Battalion, the same unit we'd covered 2 weeks earlier near the Panaro River. I switched channels, tried to raise them again. No answer, only bursts of distortion, the kind that mean wires have been cut and radios smashed. Below, something moved. Through the clouds I saw it, columns of armor, gray and angular, pushing south along the road. Panzer IVs, maybe a dozen. Infantry carriers behind them. And trapped between those teeth, a scatter of olive-drab dots. Trucks. Jeeps. Men firing upward in vain. I reported the sighting. Command's reply came seconds later, flat and rehearsed. Negative engagement. No air-to-ground authority. Return to base. The formation leader acknowledged. One by one, the Mustangs banked west, climbing out of range. I should have followed. That was the system. You observed. You reported. Someone else decided what those men's lives were worth. But I couldn't stop listening to the voice that had broken through the static. It wasn't random. I knew it. Danny Cole. Private First Class. Infantry radio man. We'd met months earlier at a forward strip when our flight covered his unit's advance. He'd shared chocolate from a ration tin, called his newborn daughter half the reason I fight. He'd asked me if the sky ever looked peaceful from up there. I'd said yes. I'd lied. Now his signal was dying in my ears, and below me the valley was burning. I radioed the leader. Request permission to make one pass, visual confirmation of friendly casualties. Silence. Then the reply, clipped. Denied. Repeat, denied. Maintain altitude. The formation kept climbing. I stayed level. The sky around me emptied. For a moment, I was alone, one aircraft, one pulse, one disobedient thought. The Germans were advancing in perfect discipline. Tanks spaced 40 yards apart, infantry moving in files beside them. From above, it looked surgical, inevitable. Our men were pinned along a drainage ditch, firing upward. No artillery support, no retreat path. My hand rested on the arming switch. The red guard was cold under my glove. I remembered my mother's voice from her letters, "Don't try to be a hero." I remembered my father saying, "If the machine listens to you, it'll save you." And beneath those two ghosts, I heard the logic of the engine, the steady hum that had always told me the truth. Heroes die for pride. Mechanics act for reason. The difference is thin, but real. I flipped the guard up. 2 bombs armed. Altitude, 9,000. Airspeed, 360. Dive angle, 45 degrees. The Mustang shuddered as I pushed the nose forward. The sun flashed across the canopy, turning the world into fire and glass. Below, the tanks began to scatter, G*N barrels tilting skyward. Tracers clawed through the air, red and white, screaming past the wings. I smelled cordite before I saw it, like burnt wires in a factory. At 3,000 feet, the flak became a storm. The radio crackled with orders I no longer heard. My breath came slow through the mask. The altimeter spun down, 2,700. 1,900. 1,200. Through the crosshair, the lead panzer filled the circle, black cross, gray armor, shadow beneath. For Danny. I released both bombs. The Mustang leapt upward as the weight vanished. I pulled hard, climbing through the explosion. The blast hit seconds later, a shockwave that rattled the canopy and painted the valley orange. I rolled to starboard and looked back. The first tank had disintegrated, turret blown clear, treads thrown like ribbons. The second burned at the edge of the road. Infantry scattered into ditches. Smoke rolled upward, thick and oily, blotting out the shape of men. For a heartbeat, I thought I was falling, but the instruments said otherwise. The plane held steady, the engine purring as if relieved. The headset erupted with Command's voice, sharp as a whip. "Carter. What the hell have you done?" I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The dive was already finished, the rule already broken. In that climb, through black smoke and flak bursts, the war changed color for me. Orders blurred. The sky no longer belonged to the system. It belonged to whoever still cared enough to look down. When I leveled out at 10,000, the valley was a single bruise of smoke and flame. Somewhere in that chaos, men were alive who shouldn't have been. I didn't know names. I didn't need to. I only knew that conscience had finally spoken louder than the radio. The radio was still alive with fury. "All units, return to base." "That's an order." I didn't answer. My hands were locked on the stick, the engine still straining in climb, the Mustang's frame humming with leftover violence. Below, the smoke from my bombs twisted into a single column, black rising through the white haze of morning. The valley looked motionless, but I knew better. A battlefield never stops moving. It only pauses to breathe. The other Mustangs were dots far to the west now, safe, obedient, nameless in the distance. I circled once, watching. The German armor had scattered, what was left of it. 2 tanks burned openly, a third tried to pivot off the road, its crew scrambling to escape the fire. Infantry broke formation, some diving into irrigation ditches, others dragging wounded men toward the barns. The order, the perfect geometry of their assault, had broken apart. That was all I wanted, to interrupt the pattern. A single fracture in their rhythm could mean minutes. And minutes, on the ground, were life. Still, the punishment would come. I'd seen it before. Men grounded, stripped of flight pay, reassigned to paperwork for far less. Insubordination, they called it, as if obedience were oxygen and disobedience a disease. I tried not to think about it. The truth was simpler, I couldn't have done otherwise. As the Mustang leveled out, I throttled back and checked the gauges. Oil pressure steady. Coolant temperature high but manageable. Ammunition, 800 rounds left. Enough to matter if I chose. I looked down again. The blast zone was still alive with movement. Through the haze, flashes of rifle fire flickered like sparks. Our infantry, tiny, stubborn silhouettes, had *N to rise. They were moving west, regrouping behind the smoke. One figure waved a signal panel, yellow against the ash. That meant friendly air cover. They thought there were more of us. They believed the strike had been planned. The irony bit deep, by breaking the rule, I had made the system appear competent. A line of tracer fire arced upward from a surviving half-track. I rolled left, dropped the nose, and squeezed the trigger. The 6 Browning .50s answered in unison, thunder and vibration, brass casing streaming past the canopy. I felt the recoil in my teeth. The rounds walked along the road, found the source, and erased it. When I pulled up again, the world went silent except for the engine's low growl. The headset crackled with new voices, control tower, flight leader, ground units all shouting across one another. None of them reached me clearly. My frequency was still half-jammed by terrain. Or maybe I didn't want to listen. At 8,000 feet, I turned north, skimming the ridge line. Flak opened up again from somewhere in the hills, black bursts, random, angry. A fragment clanged against the fuselage near the right wing root. The Mustang shuddered but held. The fuel gauge trembled toward the red. I had maybe 20 minutes before bingo. Logic said climb, return to base, land, face whatever came next. But logic had just been redefined. Through a gap in the smoke I saw motion, 2 surviving panzers trying to regroup, their commanders shouting orders from the open hatches. They were turning their G*NS downslope, toward the retreating Americans. If they fired now, the whole escape would be undone. I dropped throttle, lined up again. Altitude, 5,500. Range, half a mile. G*NS armed. No permission. No witnesses. No safety margin. Only math. I dived. The Merlin roared, the air thickened, the ground rose fast. At 4,000 feet I fired short bursts, aiming not at the armor itself but at the ground beside it. The impact kicked dust and confusion. The G*NS flinched, ducked back into their turrets. One tank's tread caught fire from stray rounds, the other reversed blindly, colliding with a wreck behind it. The valley echoed with metal on metal, then with nothing. I climbed again, heart hammering in rhythm with the propeller. The voice in my headset returned, my commanding officer this time, each word clipped by anger. Lieutenant Carter, confirm you engaged without authorization. Confirmed, sir. Return immediately. You are relieved from flight duty upon landing. Understood. I switched the radio off. The decision was done. Consequences could wait. As I crossed back over the ridge, I caught a final glimpse of the valley. The fire was spreading through the grass where the bombs had fallen. The infantry, our infantry, were pulling back in loose formation, covering each other as they moved. One of them looked up and raised a hand. Maybe he was signaling. Maybe he was saluting. I'll never know. I leveled the wings, trimmed for cruise, and let the engines hum fill the cockpit. The smell of hot oil and cordite lingered, sweet and acrid. My pulse finally slowed. In that moment, flying alone through the fractured air, I realized I had become what every regulation feared, a man whose loyalty was to the living, not the ledger. I didn't feel heroic. I felt precise. And sometimes, precision is rebellion enough. The blast rolled through the valley like thunder trapped in a canyon. From 8,000 feet it looked slow, almost gentle, a cloud swelling outward, then folding into itself. But inside that smoke, metal screamed. The lead panzer vanished beneath the detonation, its turret spinning off into the air like a tossed coin. The second tank slewed sideways, its tread thrown clear of the wheels. The rest froze. War lives by rhythm: advance, halt, fire, recover. Break that rhythm, and the line unravels. My 2 bombs had done what full artillery batteries sometimes fail to, halted the inevitable. The valley below became a painting of confusion. German officers shouted over the din, trying to rally men who no longer knew which direction was safe. Half-tracks reversed into ditches. Machine G*N nests went silent, their arcs of fire erased by the blast's dust. Then something unexpected happened. Through the haze I saw movement, our own troops, the ones who'd been pinned for hours, beginning to rise. Not charging, not yet, but standing. A handful at first, then dozens. They moved like men learning to breathe again. One squad dragged a .30 caliber G*N out from cover. Another waved signal panels. The color caught in the sunlight, yellow and red squares flashing between the smoke like sparks of order returning to chaos. I banked hard left to get a better view. The Mustang's wingtips skimmed the rising smoke. My cockpit filled with the smell of burned fuel. I could see faces now, mud-streaked, hollow, alive. They were moving west, away from the K*LL zone. The German armor, blinded and disoriented, began firing blind. Shells tore through olive groves, hitting nothing but dirt. Infantry ducked behind their own wrecks. The column that had looked invincible 15 minutes earlier was now fragmented, its logic undone. Everything I'd done was against regulation. Everything I'd feared was coming. But in that single look down, I understood the cost and the worth of disobedience at once. I stayed low, circling, my altitude barely 2,000 feet. Tracers still rose from somewhere in the smoke, lazy arcs chasing ghosts. I returned fire in short bursts, controlled, economical. Each squeeze of the trigger felt like a sentence punctuated in metal. Over the radio came fragments of overlapping chatter, ground reports, confused bearings, words like air cover and retreat route open. None addressed me directly. No one knew I was still up here. To them, it was probably a full squadron strike. A miracle of coordination. The irony tightened in my chest. I'd broken the order, and the system would take credit for its own disobedience. I climbed through 10,000 feet to get clear of the flak. The Mustang shivered, one wing riddled with holes that whistled in the slipstream. Oil pressure dipped, then stabilized. The engine sounded tired but loyal. The Merlin had never failed me. Below, I saw movement again, this time not retreat but counterfire. American artillery shells, guided by the smoke of my explosion, began to walk across the far ridge. Someone down there had seen an opening. Maybe an officer, maybe a corporal acting on instinct. It didn't matter. The airstrike, my strike, had lit the fuse for something larger. I stayed high, orbiting, conserving fuel, watching the lines shift. The Germans began to pull back. Slowly at first, then with growing disorder. Their trucks reversed, their tanks pivoted toward the northern road. The entire formation that had seemed so methodical an hour earlier was now a trail of wreckage and retreat. The valley I'd entered as an observer was no longer under siege. Smoke still hung heavy, but the rhythm had changed. The impossible, relief for the men below, was happening in real time. I looked down one last time before turning home. In the narrow field beside the road, small figures were waving something, a length of fabric torn from a parachute, held high in the smoke. A signal of thanks, or maybe disbelief. From that height I couldn't tell. But I felt it like static in the air. My instruments told me I was on borrowed time, fuel near critical, engine temperature flirting with the red. I trimmed the plane and began the long turn toward base. The sky behind me was still bruised with smoke, ahead, the horizon stretched clean and empty. In the headset, Command's voice finally came through, half static, half fury. Carter, report your position. En route to base. Do you confirm ordnance expended? Confirmed. Did you engage under authorization? The question hung there. I pressed the transmitter, then released it. Silence. The radio stayed open, waiting for a confession I couldn't give. As the coast of the Adriatic came into view, the weight of what had happened settled slowly. I had broken the central rule of air command, initiative without approval. Yet below me, hundreds of men were alive who shouldn't have been. When I landed, the official reports would reduce it to numbers: 2 bombs dropped, confirmed hits, enemy armor destroyed. They would never record the moment when orders and morality diverged at 9,000 feet. From that day forward, I understood what flying really meant. Not freedom. Not glory. Just the narrow space between obedience and conscience, where a pilot learns that sometimes the sky itself demands an answer no radio can authorize. The runway at the Medina forward strip shimmered under afternoon heat. I came in low, flaps half dead, fuel needle trembling against empty. The Mustang's right wing looked like lacework, holes, shrapnel scars, streaks of dried oil. I set her down anyway, one long scream of metal against dirt, sparks rising behind me. When she stopped, silence hit harder than flak. Ground crew ran from the hangars. One pointed at the wing, another at the smoking tail. I unbuckled, pushed the canopy open, and climbed out into sunlight that felt too clean for what I'd just done. The air smelled of hot rubber and grass. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then the commander appeared. Colonel Hensley, square shoulders, spotless uniform, voice like gravel poured through a funnel. He didn't shout at first. He just looked at the plane, then at me. You disobeyed a direct order, Lieutenant. Yes, sir. You could have been K***led. Yes, sir. His eyes didn't move. Walk with me. We crossed the tarmac in silence. Behind us, mechanics were already circling the Mustang, whispering, counting bullet holes. I heard one of them mutter, "She's lucky to be alive." He didn't mean the plane. Inside the operations shack, maps covered the walls, lines, pins, colored string. Hensley pointed to the valley I'd just left. You hit here? Yes, sir. With what? 2 500s. Full release. Who cleared you? No one. He leaned on the table. You realize what that means? I said nothing. He didn't need my answer. He exhaled, slow. You've made a mess for me, Carter. Headquarters will want a report. They'll want to know why a single Mustang broke formation and dropped ordnance without control confirmation. He looked back at me. You better hope your bombs did something worth writing about. Before I could respond, the door burst open. The radio operator from the tower stood there, face flushed, headset hanging around his neck. Sir, he gasped, message from the 36th Infantry. Germans retreating north. They say airstrike knocked out their armor, saved the whole battalion. For the first time since I'd landed, the room went still. Hensley straightened, his jaw working through words he didn't want to say. Repeat that. The operator read directly from the slip of paper. Ground report confirms, enemy armor destroyed, estimated 2 tanks and several transports. U.S. forces re-established line. They're calling it a miracle, sir. Hensley stared at the map again. His finger traced the valley. Then, quietly, a miracle. He looked back at me. The anger in his eyes hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape, tempered, complicated. You're grounded for a week, he said finally. Pending review. Yes, sir. He paused. And I'll be recommending you for the Silver Star. The sentence hit harder than any reprimand. Sir? He shrugged. Don't thank me. Command loves success, even when it smells like mutiny. Outside, mechanics had rolled the Mustang into a hangar. One of them waved me over. We're pulling flak out of her skin, he said, almost admiring. How'd she stay in one piece? Because she listened, I said. They didn't understand. They just smiled, half in awe, half in disbelief. Word had already started to spread across the base, something about one pilot diving through his own smoke, taking out tanks single-handed. Stories travel faster than discipline. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridgeline, I sat by the runway and listened to engines taxiing in from other missions. The airfield smelled of fuel, dust, and victory we weren't supposed to claim. A young mechanic, maybe 19, brought me a cup of coffee. Heard you went rogue up there, he said, trying to sound casual. Depends who's telling it. He hesitated. Those boys you saved, they sent a message through. Said to tell the pilot thank you for the sky. I didn't know what to do with that. I just nodded and watched the last plane land, a P-47 coming in heavy, its belly smeared with oil. Somewhere behind it, smoke still rose from the valley. Later that night, the colonel found me again. He didn't carry a clipboard this time. Carter, he said, command's review will take weeks. Meanwhile, the men are talking. You might want to keep your head down. Yes, sir. He looked at me for a long moment. You broke every rule we had, he said quietly. But sometimes the book runs out of pages. He walked away before I could answer. The hangar lights flickered off one by one, leaving only the silhouette of my Mustang against the dusk. Her skin was patched, scarred, still warm from flight. Grounded, decorated, condemned, forgiven, all at once. War has no single verdict. Only outcomes. And that night, for the first time since Italy, the base was quiet, not from fear or fatigue, but from the rare, uneasy respect reserved for a man who had gambled with orders and somehow come back alive. They called it Carter's Valley after that. Never officially, not on any map or briefing, but in the quiet way soldiers name things to make sense of them. The story moved through tents and airfields faster than paperwork ever could. It began as rumor, one Mustang saved a battalion, and grew with each retelling. Some said there were 2 planes, others said a whole squadron. The truth didn't matter, the pattern did. Someone had broken the rule and lived. Headquarters filed it differently. The mission log read, 1 aircraft successfully destroyed enemy armor. Allied ground forces sustained minimal losses. There was no mention of disobedience, no note of the argument, no trace of the risk. The report was clean, the kind bureaucrats like, an act of rebellion polished into procedure. Still, the residue of it lingered. In the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted in the air wing. Orders began to end with a new phrase, use your judgment. It wasn't written, but it was said. The phrase gave permission without admitting it. Men started flying lower, thinking faster, trusting the heartbeat of their engines as much as the voice in their headset. The machine had grown a conscience, 1 pilot at a time. For me, the grounding lasted 6 days. They couldn't keep me out longer, too many pilots were needed, too many missions flew at half strength. When they called me back, the colonel handed me my flight record. His expression was unreadable. "They've cleared you," he said. "Apparently miracles require witnesses, not explanations." I nodded. He added, almost as an afterthought, "Next time, Lieutenant, try to warn me before you rewrite the doctrine." I flew again the next morning, same cockpit, same patched wings, same hum in the control stick. But the world beneath had changed. The 36th Battalion was moving north now, the valley secure. From altitude, the scars of battle looked small, 2 black craters, a thin line of ash, the outline of roads mended by engineers. Yet each mark was a reminder that rules are only as strong as the lives they protect. The squadron treated me differently after that. Not as a hero, not even as a friend, more like a quiet variable in an equation they were still solving. Pilots nodded when I entered the mess. Mechanics saluted without meeting my eyes. A few asked what it felt like. I never told them. There are no words for the second before defiance becomes instinct. Weeks later, a letter arrived from a field hospital near Florence. It was unsigned, but I recognized the handwriting. Danny Cole. The lines were shaky, "Heard what you did. The smoke came down right before they had us. Don't know how you saw us through that fog, but we owe you everything." My girl's picture made it out clean. Maybe I will too. I folded the letter and kept it in the flight log beside the maintenance sheets. Paper over paper, the war's 2 truths living side by side. By summer, the 12th Air Force was pushing deeper into the north. Our missions grew longer, the front lines harder to define. Yet that phrase, use your judgment, began appearing in more and more debriefs. It moved across the chain of command like contraband reason. Years later, when I read the official histories, I searched for that day. It was there, but buried, 1 line among thousands. April 3, 1944, successful air-ground coordination, Medina Sector. No name. No mention of the order I'd refused. That was fine. Records are meant for the living, not for the truth. After the war, I returned to Iowa. Married a nurse who'd served in Naples. We built a small airfield outside Des Moines, training young pilots who had never seen flak or heard the sound of an engine catching fire at altitude. I told them what my instructors had never said, that the checklist ends where judgment begins. That a machine is loyal only to those who understand it. That obedience is valuable, but clarity, when it comes, is sacred. Sometimes, on still evenings, I'd roll the old Mustang's throttle just enough to feel her shiver. The metal would vibrate the same way it had over Medina. I'd close my eyes and hear the valley again, the noise, the heat, the impossible decision that became a doctrine no general ever signed. They gave me medals later, years too late to matter. Silver, bronze, silk ribbons polished to ceremony. None carried the weight of the sentence one wounded soldier had written in pencil on the back of a ration card. He saw us when no one else did. That was enough legacy for me, not a victory, not a headline, just a correction carved quietly into history by a single act of disobedience that turned out to be mercy. In the archives, the report is a single dry line: 1 aircraft successfully destroyed enemy armor. No friendly losses reported. No name, no emotion, just the tidy language of survival turned into statistics. But among the men who walked out of that valley, the ones who still wrote letters home from hospital tents, who still cleaned their rifles in silence before sleep, the story had a different ending. They said a lone pilot appeared through the smoke when all hope was gone. They said he came from nowhere, dove straight into hell, and left the sky burning behind him. I've heard it told 100 ways, each less accurate than the last. Yet one line remains unchanged, passed between soldiers like a secret prayer. He broke the order, and saved us all. That is how history remembers disobedience, not as defiance, but as the moment duty finally learned how to listen.